C'è scritto Luciano?
Sì.
Puoi includere, no?
Se sta alla riunione delle 17,
può proseguire poi?
Sì, prosegue perché no.
Ma quello immaginavo io, però non ero sicuro.
Gli studenti entrano 17, quando era cosa 17, no? C'erano due cose, una del 16 e una del 17. Sì, sì, 17. Loro rimangono collegati, i dottorati si collegano a quella 17, l'unica cosa che cambia è se lo dico, se lo spiegare. Quindi Luciano basta che rimane collegato.
Ma quello immaginavo, però per essere sicuro ho detto sì a Massimiliano perché
sì, ma scritto
io immaginavo che fosse così, cioè, però non ero sicuro.
Adesso ti scrivo perché
ho detto quella è la forma migliore. Perché...
C'è il numero che hanno
di Luciano?
Online.
Allora, Maurizio Yucastar.
Ok. Buonasera a tutti. Io sono Maurizio Franzini, il mio compito è quello di introdurre la seconda lezione caffè del professor Jeffrey Sachs, che ringraziamo ancora per essere qui con noi oggi, e lo faccio con molto piacere per vari motivi, incluso il fatto che quella di ieri è stata una lezione molto molto bella e quindi mi fa più piacere ancora introdurre la seconda lezione del professor Sachs. Devo dire che la lezione di ieri all'inizio ci ha provocato qualche agitazione, non so come dire, in un'epoca in cui i motivi per stare agitati non mancano, descrivendoci questo mondo distopico che è, diciamo, non lontanissimo nel tempo se nulla accade. E quindi abbiamo iniziato con questa sensazione di agitazione, però il professor Sachs ha promesso che ci porta a un crossroad, a un crocevia dove è indicata la strada che porta alla grande trasformazione, e quindi oggi questo sarà il suo compito. La grande trasformazione, come sappiamo, è un termine, è il titolo di un libro di Karl Polanyi, molto famoso, molto noto, che usò, diciamo, in questo libro denunciò un'utopia, non una distopia, l'utopia di disembed, come diceva lui, di tirare fuori l'economia dalla società, con tutte le conseguenze in termini di trasformare in merci il lavoro, la terra, la natura, cioè le cose di cui abbiamo parlato abbondantemente ieri. Forse è interessante, sarebbe interessante riflettere sull'utopia di Polanyi, la distopia di Jeffrey Sachs, però questo lo rimandiamo a un'altra occasione. Polanyi scrisse anche: al posto degli uomini abbiamo sostituito i numeri, e alla compassione nei confronti delle sofferenze umane abbiamo sostituito l'assillo dei riequilibri contabili. E non è vero, non l'ha scritto Polanyi, ho imbrogliato, questo l'ha scritto Caffè, però l'avrebbe potuto scrivere Polanyi, e quindi mi piace molto che Jeffrey ci abbia dato anche l'occasione di fare questo accostamento tra quello che pensava Caffè e quello che pensava Polanyi. E quindi a questo punto direi che torniamo al nostro crocevia, do la parola a Jeffrey perché ci indichi la strada della grande e buona trasformazione. Grazie, a te la parola.
Mauricio, thank you very, very much. And what a great honor and pleasure it is to be with you in the Federico Caffè lecture for this year. And I want to thank also Mario Tiberi for the generous invitation to be this year's lecturer. Indeed, I want to talk about a great transformation, great in scale, and I hope this time great in quality. The great transformation that Carl Polanyi discussed was the deep transformation to a global market economy, but he did not regard it as great in the term of the summum bonum, as the great good. He regarded it as a great harm, as Mauricio Franzini has just noted. He regarded it as a harm because it commodified society, human beings, took away the social networks, the social protection. And according to Polanyi, who was writing at the middle of the last century at the time of World War II, it was a great calamity, in fact. I use the title as an echo because I think that we can go back from that kind of deracination, the uprooting, to create a new, this time truly global society, because that is our reality, both as a global species that is interconnected and as a world that is deeply integrated by technology and finance and trade and movement of people and of pathogens. We can create a global society that has roots in human well-being and in sustainable development. I discussed yesterday the idea of sustainable development as a practical idea of a society that is at once prosperous, socially inclusive, and environmentally sustainable. And that is both an idea that is a normative goal, in my view, but also a practical and achievable objective. But that is to be verified. Is it possible to have a world of prosperity with 9 billion people or 10 billion people or even 11 billion people on the planet facing all of the harrowing realities of worsening climate, of outbreaks of new diseases, of loss of biodiversity? Well, this, I believe, as I said, is fundamentally a choice, but not a simple choice. It's not a choice for us as individuals. It is a choice for us together, because we have a global reality that we face together, and a decentralized approach will not be sufficient. The self-organizing approach of markets clearly is not taking us to sustainable development. It is bringing us to wealth and inequality. It is bringing us to growth of GDP, but not growth of well-being. It is bringing us to absolutely deepening and dangerous environmental threats and social instabilities. So this is why I describe this as a crossroads. Now, I described yesterday what I regard as the pillars of transformation, and I mentioned 6, being education at the core, really, because we need for individual empowerment and for guiding our societies in a sensible way, we need an educated population. That's true for every child who looks for a future with decent jobs, livelihoods, and an ability to navigate this complicated world. And it's true for societies as a whole, those that leave behind large parts of society uneducated, whether it's the girls or different ethnic groups within a society, put themselves at profound danger. The second pillar is healthcare, both the medical and public health, obviously dramatized this year in COVID-19. The third is clean energy and industry, lest we destroy the air, the water, and the climate system that supports us. The fourth is sustainable land use, so that we can feed the planet with healthful, nutritious, and sustainable food production. We do not achieve that now. Malthus has not yet been proven wrong, and this is profoundly challenging for us, with half of the world malnourished, either by terrible insufficiency of food intake or terrible imbalance of diets. We have a crisis that afflicts at least 4 billion people on the planet, and the food system itself is not stable or sustainable in practice, because it is the major sector that contributes to the loss of biodiversity and the climate change. The fifth area that I mentioned was urbanization, because we are now, for the first time, an urban species. Even though we think about Rome as the eternal city, Rome was and it was a vast city in the Roman Empire already. The cities throughout history have been only a small part of the human settlement up until the 19th century. Well under 10% of human beings lived in cities. But as of the past decade, we crossed the 50% mark. According to the UN estimates, we're at 55% urban, but it's going to rise sharply to 75 or 80%, I believe, by mid-century. The reason being, most fundamentally, that labor productivity in agriculture rises, and especially with mechanization, with robotics, with precision agriculture, this will continue and even accelerate. And that means that the jobs will be in services primarily, and that means urban life primarily. So we will see the need for cities that are viable, that are healthful, that are sustainable. And that is the fifth pillar of the Great Transformation. And the sixth is mobilizing this ongoing and this year accelerating digital revolution, which itself is, I think, fair to say, probably 90 years in the making by now. So while we feel that the digital age is suddenly upon us as we Zoom every day, the truth is that it has its foundations in conceptual breakthroughs already in the 1930s, when the British genius Alan Turing conceived the idea of a universal computer. And the Hungarian genius John von Neumann created an architecture for that computer and then built it in World War II and afterwards with vacuum tubes. And then with the invention of the transistor and the integrated circuit, and then microprocessors, we embarked on what came to be called Moore's Law, where the capacity to compute and to transmit data has been doubling every 1 to 2 years now for 60 years. And that's a lot of doublings. If you do 30 doublings, 2 to the 30th power, you're gaining billions-fold increased capacity. And that's where we are today with our nonstop transmission of data, information, real streaming of videos and movies and fake news and cyber warfare and hacking and all of the rest of our current digital age. But this transformation is profound. Like all technological breakthroughs of the past, it is on the one side potentially enormously promising, because it could create access for every person on the planet to healthcare, to new forms of education, to more participation in government, to access to payments, e-commerce, many, many benefits. On the other hand, like all major technologies, it's got a deep, dark side, obviously surveillance, loss of privacy, but even more than that, cyber warfare, because unfortunately, it is our curse as human beings with our us versus them psychologies that we take every technology and we weaponize them. And so technologies are quickly grabbed by the generals and militarized. And I witnessed a horrifying discussion by NATO generals a couple of years ago. It wasn't meant to be horrifying. I just found it horrifying, by the generals saying how we will beat the Chinese at artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is a gift of technology. It's not to beat another part of the world for military purposes. It's to use for human well-being. So this is the sixth transformational challenge. But to bring about these large changes when our course is quite a different way is the profound puzzle how do we make our politics work? What are the rules of the game? How should we think about the big challenges we face? And that's what I want to discuss today. And when I write up these lectures, what I'll try to describe in detail about how we actually get to mid-century in the sustainable development trajectory rather than the dystopian threat. So I'll share my screen and try to motivate this great transformation and how we could actually achieve it. So I will discuss these pillars of the great transformation. In other words, I want to think about how society can choose to change. Can we really choose in a collective way a direction, or is that naive? Does history just flow in its course beyond the ability to choose? Can we choose wisely? Can we choose together? Are we bound to a direction of conflict or greed, or could we actually choose a path of sustainable development? So I want to talk about the following ideas. First, the idea of setting goals as guideposts for society. It's not so simple. We generally don't have long-term goals. And one of the things that the advocates of laissez-faire told us, and some bad renditions of post-Darwinian thought told us, is that we evolve in an open-ended way. We don't choose, we evolve. And some think that that's good. I think that that is not what we need. I want to talk about setting goals and achieving them. Second, I want to talk about the conceptual or analytical strategy for how to achieve goals, and that is the design of technological pathways. I put an emphasis on technology because the deep transformations require, most of all, changes in technology over the next 30 years. 30 years is a relatively short time for a deep transformation of technology. But it's hard to imagine it going faster, and it's hard to think about planning for an even longer period because of all of the uncertainties. So I believe we can make technology pathways not as precise forecasts, but as guidelines on a 30-year horizon. Then I want to talk about the kinds of public policies to support the technological pathways. Then I want to talk about finance, because finance is the allocation of resources for investments. Investments are to embody the technological change. And we need to ask, how will our resources in society, guided as they are by government and by the business sector, actually align with the technological pathways that take us to sustainable development, that carry us to our goals? That brings the fifth question, which is the corporate or the business alignment. Currently, our politics are driven heavily by our business sector, especially in the United States. We are guided by business lobbies rather than determining the direction of business. And this, I think, is what needs to change in our conception of the company and how it operates. Then I want to talk about the international dimensions of the great transformation. First, the crucial role of regional integration, like the European Union, which is, in my view, indispensable. But we need the European Union example replicated in different regions of the world. In Africa, with the success of the African Union, or in other regions. Generally, though, other regions don't cooperate. They're often at war within the region. And this is one of the legacies of the Cold War, that a Cold War structure, say a competition between the US and the Soviet Union as it existed from World War II, or the end of World War II up to 1991, also divided regions like South Asia between the parts on the US side versus the Soviet side, or the parts of East Asia that were under the US security umbrella versus those that were on the other side. Now the world is at risk of being divided again, with regions dividing pro-China and against China. And I want to argue that that is extraordinarily dangerous from the point of view of achieving sustainable development. And then finally, I want to end on ethics, because what is ethics? Ethics means choosing for the good. And everything I'm talking about, therefore, is about choice and is fundamentally, therefore, about ethics. So I want to talk about the ethics of sustainable development as the last pillar of this deep transformation. Let me start with goal-based development and start with the president in my lifetime, who was my favorite president and whose leadership style, I think, had a lot to commend. Of course, there were, in his brief 3 years as president, mistakes as well, but he had a certain style, which was setting big goals for the United States. And we remember those goals even till today, because he excited the country with a vision. So he said that we could set big goals and then work towards those goals. And one of the smart things he said in 1963, when he was convincing Americans to support his initiative for peace with the Soviet Union, to sign the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, he said the following about setting goals. He said that peace need not be impracticable and war need not be inevitable. By defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we can help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly toward it. So I want to draw your attention to this lesson in leadership. Kennedy was explaining that the issues of war and peace are not issues of inevitability, they are issues of choices. And that thinking about peace doesn't mean that you're impractical, and war is not inevitable, as many people thought, but this is a choice. And then he said, peace is our goal. So how do we make peace actually realized? And he put it in this very interesting way from my point of view. He said, define the goal more clearly. Make it seem more manageable and less remote. In other words, be specific about how you're going to achieve the peace. Show that it's manageable, that it's not some distant dream, but something practical. And then we can help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly toward it. I regard this as a philosophy of leadership and as a strategy of social change. It says not merely to have goals, but to make them seem manageable by defining for society how those goals can actually be achieved. We don't do that very often, by the way. Our societies don't set big goals. And then often when we set them, they float as, wouldn't that be nice? And they give rise to cynicism because we don't demonstrate how the goal can actually be achieved. Since I work on global goals like the Sustainable Development Goals and previously the Millennium Development Goals, this is a matter of frustration for me, because we announce globally we want to end poverty or we want to keep the climate safe, but we don't show manageably how to do it. And because of that, people are often cynically responding to the goals rather than drawing hope from the goals. So Kennedy was onto something, I think, very smart and very deep from a leadership point of view. And of course, one goal that he set was going to the moon. And this is quite a remarkable story. It's the story of my childhood in the United States, because I was 7 years old when the first astronaut went into orbit. I was 15 years old when Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. So you can imagine for somebody age 7 to age 15, how this moon adventure loomed very large in the imagination. Now, Kennedy was the one that launched that idea. In a speech on May 25th, 1961, he said these famous lines to the Congress. He said, "I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish." I love this quotation. Why? First, bold goal, go to the moon and back. Second, a timeline, not just an idealistic statement, before this decade is out, during the 1960s. Unbelievable. When Kennedy made this statement, one US astronaut had gone up for 15 minutes in space. And then Kennedy said, after that 15-minute suborbital mission, now let's go to the moon. So he set a bold goal and he set a timeline. And then, in a way that politicians do not speak this way now, he said, okay, no project will be more impressive or more important. But then he said, as a politician, none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish. Our politicians today would say, none will be so easy, almost free. But Kennedy led the nation by saying, none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish. What's the lesson of that? As soon as he said these lines, the Congress stood up and applauded and said, we'll do it, because they felt that he was conveying something achievable, bold, and that he was being realistic about the challenge. He said the following year about the moonshot, also these words, which for Americans resonate till today. He said, we choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills, because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too. And of course, by 1969, so just 8 years after the speech, Neil Armstrong stepped foot on the moon, and Buzz Aldrin and got to the moon and came back safely to Earth. And so it was 8 years to succeed in the moonshot. And during that time, the US government led a massive and expensive and difficult effort that employed 400,000 people and 20,000 private companies to bring about the success of the moonshot. Its implications for the long term were vast, because it was the dramatic build out of America's advanced technologies in many, many areas, in semiconductors, in computing, obviously in space and aeronautics, and in many other fields. And it had a legacy that lasted decades in terms of technological leadership. But the point is, a country got behind a goal and spent a lot of money and worked on it consistently and achieved the goal. Now, how to achieve a goal like decarbonizing the energy system, which is a similar goal. And our politicians can stand up and say, I believe that by mid-century, this country and this world should decarbonize our energy systems, convert to renewable energy, so that we provide a planet that is safe for our children and for future generations. No mission will be more important. You could say none will be more difficult to achieve, though this one is probably easier to achieve than the moonshot. But in order to do it, we have to think like NASA did in the 1960s moonshot, understand what the technology pathways are to achieve that goal, or the other goals that I mentioned: universal access to schooling, universal access to healthcare, sustainable cities, circular economy for industry, sustainable land use. Each of these requires its technology pathways. And when it comes to the case of greenhouse gas emissions and climate, we know a lot. We know that we have to reach net zero emissions by mid-century. At least we know what we have to do. We have a timeline, and we know that we need to do this because that is the only way to have a preponderance of likelihood, technically a 2/3 probability of staying below 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is a dangerous level of warming, and very dangerous if we were to overshoot that limit. So we know that we need to decarbonize by mid-century. And then we can get to work analytically, especially our engineers. And this is a mock-up of how the energy system can transform. It is too hard for you to see and for me to describe in detail, but I will do so in print. The top half of the figure shows the energy system of the United States for the year 2020. The bottom is the energy system that we would target in 2050. The left-hand side, both top and bottom, are the primary energy sources. The right-hand side are the energy using sectors. So in 2020, the main sources of energy are coal, petroleum, and natural gas. The US, like all of our economies, almost without exception, is a fossil fuel-based economy. And on the right-hand side are the three main using sectors: buildings, industry, and transportation. In the scenario at the bottom, though, by the time we get to 2050, the primary energy sources primarily are solar and wind and biomass and hydrocarbons, with a little bit of remaining fossil fuels. And of course, those renewable energy sources, zero carbon, then power the three end-use sectors: buildings, industry, and transport, by transformation of end-use systems. Instead of heating buildings with fuel oil or diesel or natural gas, we would heat buildings with electricity. Instead of our cars running on petrol, of course, our cars will run on electricity with electric vehicles. And now the electric vehicle companies are the most highly valued automobile manufacturing companies in the world this year, because suddenly the investors have figured out we're going to make a great transformation of transportation from the internal combustion engine to electric vehicles. But the point is that once you set the goal, get to zero by 2050, you can then set the technology pathways. Not in every detail, because as technologies evolve, there will be better choices and worse choices. We don't really know how much will be wind, how much onshore, offshore, how much will be solar, but we do know the direction of change. And therefore, we can invest in that change and invest in the research and development to bring about the change. Similarly, for sustainable diets and sustainable land use, we know about the deep transformations that need to be made. This graph, also a complicated one, is a table from a paper called the Eat Lancet Commission Report, which is a study of sustainable, healthful diets and the land use practices to produce those food supplies. And the message of the Eat Lancet Commission is that our current food system is both unhealthy and environmentally unsustainable. It's unhealthy because it is leading to both micro nutrient deficiencies and obesity, and it is unsustainable in that it is contributing to greenhouse gas emissions, deforestation, depletion of water supplies, too much nitrogen and phosphorus flux through chemical fertilizers, and the loss of biodiversity. So what this study did in looking at technology pathways is to look at ways to change technologically how the food system works, how to reduce food loss and waste, how to boost farm productivity, how to shift from meat-based proteins to plant and aquaculture-based proteins, both for better health and for less danger to the natural environment. So the point of this slide and of that study is that just as we can make a technological pathway for energy transformation, we can make a technological pathway for food sector transformation. And the Eat Lancet Commission did a global technology pathway for healthy diets and food production in different parts of the world. But such a study then provides a general framework, but it needs to be then downscaled to each country and region, because we have hundreds of food systems, in fact, different cultures and different farm practices, different soils, microclimates, and so forth. And we need to understand how each of these can be transformed in a sustainable manner. It is a technology pathway. Similarly with cities, how will our cities look in 2050? How should they look to be more livable, to be more healthful, to be safer, to be more productive? We know certain things. There will be more work and leisure from home rather than from offices. That's one of the lessons of this year, but it's a lesson that was already taking shape through the digital revolution. There will be much more e-services. Government, healthcare, education, finance, entertainment will be much more online, and that will change actually the movement within cities. We will have more e-commerce. For the last 2,000 years, the most effective way to organize retail was to go to a market. You went to a market because you didn't know what you wanted, and the producers didn't know who was going to be there to buy, so you aggregated the consumers and the suppliers together in a marketplace. It could have been an open air market, it could have been a market festival, it could be a mall, it could be a retail strip, it could be a central business district, but it was a marketplace. With e-commerce, you connect consumers and producers directly. And now we shop online and we get deliveries directly. It's actually far more efficient. There's less motion in total, less transport, less congestion. There's one problem, which is that Jeffrey Bezos ends up owning half the universe, it seems. But this movement to e-commerce is a long-term trend. It will reshape our cities. We probably won't have rush hours the way we do now, because there won't be the rush to work at 8 a.m. and the rush back from work at 5 or 6 p.m. We will have visits to offices, but we won't have regular schedules the same way. We won't own cars as in the past. This is already changing rapidly because of the digital revolution. Car sharing rather than car owning. We probably won't have drivers in the future, but rather autonomous, smaller electric vehicles. And we will reclaim our streets, therefore, away from parking, away from vehicles, much more for walking, biking, and green spaces. Again, technological pathways based on human choices of what will be a more healthful, pleasant, greener, less congested, less polluted, more productive way to live. These are just some ideas, but again, they suggest the pathways involved. Now, public policy then needs to enter to support the chosen pathway. If it's something like a moonshot, public policy is pretty clear. Give NASA a lot of money to hire a lot of engineers, to build a lot of new technology, to make a sequential process to get to the moon. And so NASA spent 1/4 to 0.5% of US GDP every year. As I said, hired tens of thousands of engineers and hundreds of thousands of workers. Policy was in a way straightforward. It was a government procurement process. Buy the spaceships and the technology to get to the moon. When it comes to decarbonization of energy or changing land use patterns or restructuring cities, policies are necessarily much more complicated. One part of policy making is to think about what tools to use. And an interesting conceptualization is a policy ladder that was devised by some bioethicists about a decade ago for the UK government, where they talked about a ladder that starts at the least kind of intervention, do nothing, or just monitor the situation, to the step at the top of the ladder, which is regulate exactly what you want. So eliminate choice. And as you go up the ladder in this policy space, you go from do nothing to provide information or require disclosure, to enable a wider set of choices, to guide those choices, for example, through indicating that a certain direction is better for your health. And then a step higher is guide the choices through incentives by giving, for example, an incentive to buy electric vehicles rather than internal combustion engines. The next higher step is disincentives, correct the market failures by taxing the bad. For example, put a tax on petrol or on internal combustion engine vehicles. The next level is restrict the choice to say, look, you can only buy the following kinds of vehicles. And the top level is eliminate the choice. If you want a car, it will be an electric vehicle. I find this very helpful because economists almost always end directly. They go, if they're going to go to this ladder, they go to the middle. Guide choices through incentives. Use financial and other incentives to guide people one way or another. I think that this is too limited a way to think about policy space. When Europe came to say, how do we decarbonize? It quickly jumped to the tradable permit system, the European trading system. I don't think it works very well. I would urge going higher on the ladder, actually. And I believe, for example, we should have the principle that if you want a car in the future, it will be an electric vehicle. Then comes the technical question, how fast could we get to such a choice? 2030, 2035, like California has just adopted, and so forth. But I don't want to settle the question because it depends on the subject matter. NASA wasn't about market incentives. NASA was about directed procurement, period. So it wasn't a matter of choice, it was a matter of purchasing and developing technologies for a specific option. I think when it comes to decarbonizing the energy system, we should be higher on the ladder, directing our utilities, no more coal plants, no more fossil fuel plants, no more electric vehicles sold after 2030, and so forth. And that those would be more powerful tools to get us where we want to go. Suffice it to say, this is the kind of issue that Professor Caffè worked on, which is the design of economic policy. And we have many choices for designing the economic policy supports for the technology pathways. Then comes the question, how do you pay for it? Because we will have a monetary economy. In other words, we pay. We don't barter. We pay for the resources that we need, whether it is through a regulated approach, a public procurement approach, or a market-based instrument approach. We need to understand the finances. And there are many, many issues to raise about the great transformation. I spend a tremendous amount of my time trying to understand how much things cost. How much would it cost to decarbonize the energy system? The evidence seems to be that it would be about 0.5% of GDP per year to have an energy system that is built on renewables rather than fossil fuels. That's a rough estimate, but what it tells us is that there's nothing unaffordable about moving to a decarbonized energy system. It's not true that we need a revolution to achieve this, or that we need a fundamental transformation of living standards. The fact of the matter is that a low carbon energy system is really not more expensive than a fossil fuel based energy system if it's phased in over a period of 20 or 30 years. And so that tells us that the financing issue is not the first order issue, though it is important. The point I would stress about financing, first of all, is that there is different kind of financing for different objectives. When it comes to the provision of universal services like health and education, for a variety of reasons, in my opinion, it's vital that that kind of financing go through budgets rather than through markets. In the United States, healthcare is largely a market commodity, and so the poor don't have access to decent healthcare, or perhaps any health insurance at all. And that is what happens when you take a category that should be financed through a budget and you finance it through a market. So I identify three broad buckets of financing, or three broad mechanisms: market, budget financing, tax and spend, or borrow, spend, and then service the debt through the budget. Second, blended financing, which is mixed public and private financing. And that generally applies for most infrastructure where there's private company role and a budgetary role. And then there's market financing, which is for financing lots of businesses that are involved, for example, in e-commerce or in automobile manufacturing and sales and so on, where because of the market structure and the nature of the technology, you can find a reasonable market solution. So the first point I would emphasize on a real science of financing for transformation is to understand the various categories of financing. Again, in market economics, we tend to jump to market financing. If you ask, how do you finance decarbonization? A typical economist's answer would be green bonds. But I would say a more important answer is the budget, thank you, because what is really needed is budgetary financing, procurement, R&D outlays, and so forth, that run, and infrastructure spending that run through the budget rather than through market financing. Now, there are three big issues that financial analysis requires that I will write about, but can't discuss at length right now. One is the long-term budget stability, a question very apropos for Italy and the United States, because both our governments have massive debts. Our politicians are not generally too interested in those debts. And the question is the long-term fiscal sustainability, even solvency of our governments, both at national and local level. So there is intergenerational or intertemporal budget accounting and so-called fiscal gap analysis that is one of the tools for analyzing the Great Transformation. There's a second big issue, which is that most developing countries need a massive increase of infrastructure. They need it for electrification, for especially renewables, for transport, for fiber, for connectivity, and so forth. How will this be financed? Poor countries don't have the financing within budgets, certainly, and they generally don't have the financing available from end-use consumers because of poverty. And so there has to be some kind of financing by borrowing. And then comes the question of the borrowing capacity or the debt service sustainability of developing as as a major issue. Again, I won't elaborate more except to say that for many countries, it will not be feasible to carry out this investment program merely on the basis of government finance that currently exists. There is, and that's the third category, an SDG financing gap. In other words, for low and middle income countries, governments need to spend more than they can reasonably raise through domestic revenues or through their own market borrowing. And I worked on a project with the International Monetary Fund over a couple of years, 2 years ago, which asked the question for a category of countries called LIDCs, which is 57 low-income developing countries that are members of the IMF, whether they had the means to finance the Sustainable Development Goals out of their own revenues. And the IMF concluded that the answer was no. And it made an analysis that something like this. It said that these countries would need to spend an extra $520 billion in the year 2030 for meeting the Sustainable Development Goals, and that these countries could raise more tax revenue to do it. That's what's shown in the green. But these countries could not raise enough tax revenue to cover the full $520 billion per year cost. There would be a gap, and the gap would be on the order of $300 billion a year. But the IMF said, yes, the rich countries will have to help the poor countries to finance this expenditure, but the gap is only 0.3 of 1% of world GDP. So the point that I want to emphasize here is that in order to fund or finance the investment pathway for sustainable development, poor countries will need help from rich countries. But the amount of help will not be a huge burden, but it will be some burden. And so if we're going to have a world in which the poorer countries can achieve sustainable development, there will need to be net international transfers in order to bring that about. Within Europe, of course, this was the debate at the beginning of the year. To achieve the European Green Deal, it was decided there had to be some transfers within Europe as well. and it was a huge fight. But in the end, the budget was approved with a fund, a recovery fund, that is a European-wide transfer mechanism. Even though the Germans have long said that the European Union is not a transfer union, there's a little bit of transfer built in this year. And I say thank goodness, because that's how normal societies react to inequalities. There need to be some transfers, and that is true at the global level as well. Now, businesses need to be part of this story too. Of course, they need to be part of it through market incentives and through a regulatory framework that instructs business, this is the direction we're going, not the other direction. And then businesses living within that regulated framework will invest on the sustainable development trajectory rather than the dystopian trajectory. But we do not currently have the corporate accountability standards to move to the sustainable development trajectory. So part of our homework to redirect from the dangerous course to the sustainable development course is new corporate accountability standards. And there are many efforts around the world right now to build those new standards. I think that they involve at least 3 different areas of business performance. First, these standards should ensure accountability and disclosure of risk for a company's products and its production processes and the environmental risks that it faces by being near coastlines or dependent on rainfall or other climate variables. So the first part of accountability standards is that there needs to be disclosure and corporate accountability that the products are safe and sustainable and that the production processes are safe and sustainable. Second, and more complicated, we need new standards for global supply chains, for global value chains. If a European company buys soybeans from Brazil and the soybeans are produced by a farm that has illegally cut down part of the Amazon rainforest, we want to prevent that kind of global value chain where the upstream production is unsustainable. But a downstream buyer currently would say, I don't know where it came from, I just buy it. And what we need is accountability along the entire value chain if we are going to make the transformation to sustainable development. We also need transparency and accountability on business regarding the internal governance, that it is fair and law-abiding, the taxes paid by the companies, and the lobbying activities. As I said, in the United States, our political system has become so corrupt, so much money flowing, that essentially the businesses have been writing the regulations rather than the regulators writing the guidelines for business. And this has been going on for 40 years in the United States. Companies gamed the political system. So if we are going to choose the sustainable development trajectory, it has to be because businesses are told the path rather than paying themselves to get the path that they want, the path of least resistance. The next point that I want to emphasize is that to accomplish these technology pathways, we need cooperation beyond national borders. We need regional cooperation. If Europe is going to decarbonize, an old idea, not yet in place, but a correct idea, is that Europe should create with its neighborhood, both the Eastern Mediterranean and North Africa, a renewable energy grid that also enables Europe to power itself not only by wind and the sunshine of Europe, but also the sunshine of North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean and the Arabian Peninsula. The larger is the network, the more stable and balanced is the system, and the less storage costs for operating a system like this, because each of these different sources of renewable energy are only partially correlated or even anti-correlated with other sources, so that when it's windy in one place, it's sunny in another. Or when it's windy in the North Sea, the air is still in the Black Sea, but when it's windy in the Black Sea, the air is still in the North Sea. And by connecting the two, you stabilize the amount of overall wind energy that can be harvested at a given time. And by having more stability of the intermittent energy, you need less expensive storage capacity. Now, this is just one example of why regional integration is so important. Europe needs not only a European Green Deal as an idea, it needs a European grid. It needs a European system for managing renewable energy. It can't just be 27 individual countries, each making their own separate investment plan. That would be hugely inefficient. This is true for every region of the world. Japan, Korea, China, Mongolia, Russia should be thinking about an integrated renewable energy system, because Russia has hydropower and wind. Japan has wind in Hokkaido, for example. The Gobi Desert in Mongolia has massive potential for solar and for wind, and so on. And so here you have one of the most prosperous, crowded regions of the world needing renewable energy, because all of the countries, actually, especially China, Japan, and Korea, have each pledged decarbonization timelines. But if they do it individually, the costs will be huge. If they do it together, then it will be much less costly and much more efficient and resilient to have an interconnected energy system. In the United States, we should have a grid that connects Canada, which has lots of hydropower, with the United States, which has wind and solar, with Mexico, which has lots of solar. And so here is a schema of a set of long-distance transmission grids that connect the quality renewable energy on the North American continent. My point is, if you have political divisions within regions, this is extraordinarily costly, even devastating, from the point of view of achieving sustainable development. Whereas if you have cooperation, then you can build out long-distance fiber, land-based transport, renewable energy systems for an efficient, digital, extended economy. And the Belt and Road Initiative of China is a part of that, in my view. Again, the United States freaked out with the Belt and Road Initiative. Don't join, terrible thing. But the basic idea that China said, we need an infrastructure that extends from China to Europe, that's efficient and that replicates the Silk Road of 2,000 years ago, or the Silk Road during the Mongol Empire, but now is the digital and renewable Silk Road, to my mind, makes a lot of sense. Again, regional cooperation is essential for that. Which regions? This is a map of the World Bank regions, and they're not bad. In fact, the Americas are divided into two main regions, the US and Canada and Latin America. Europe and Russia and the Central Asian countries, so it's Europe and the CIS, in the World Bank is one region, but that could be two political regions. North Africa and the Middle East, the Arab region, by and large, South Asia, including Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and the Asia Pacific region, China, Japan, Korea, Oceania, and ASEAN countries. Now, the big problem is for a number of these regions, the countries don't talk to each other. South Asia, of course, is one of the most dangerous places on the planet because of the standoff between Pakistan and India, two nuclear powers. They don't trade with each other. There's no logistical connection, but they share the river system of the Punjab, for heaven's sake. They have tremendous possibility of sharing renewable energy. And so peace and integration of South Asia would be a huge, huge benefit. Similarly, in the Asia Pacific region, for geopolitical reasons and historical reasons, China is viewed by the US alliance as a threat, not as a connection. But in my opinion, we should be thinking about exactly what's shown in red here. This is almost the definition of what is now called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, which is the 15 countries connecting China, Japan, Korea, plus Australia and New Zealand, plus the 10 countries of ASEAN, making 15 countries with about a quarter of the world's population that should be on the same side, not divided by a Cold War, but working together for renewable energy and sustainable riversheds, because all of these countries share rivers, the Irrawaddy and the Salween and many other river systems, the Mekong, that need interregional cooperation for their sustainability. And so this kind of regional cooperation to me is a basic stepping stone for achieving the sustainable development goals, because regions have an inherent reason to work together, and they have, I think, tremendous incentives to work together. But empires like to behave as divide and conquer. So the United States was saying to Japan and Korea, don't join with China in a trade group. We'll create a separate trade group for Asia that won't include China. I thought it was absurd. How can you have an Asia trade group that doesn't include the major trading country? That's an American idea, but not a very good one, in my view. So the point I'm making is that we should think about the implementation of these technology pathways with financing at a regional level, and with regional development banking like EIB, the European Investment Bank, or the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, EBRD, and so forth. We need global cooperation, because while the regions are the vital building blocks for the specific investments that need to be made, the geopolitical piece is absolutely the center point for keeping our attention on what is really important and keeping away from the competitive and destructive threats of war and conflict. And this is why I think the United Nations is so absolutely essential. And it is, in my view, very important that in 2021, there is, by virtue of a calendar delayed by COVID, 4 global scale conferences that are needed as building blocks to the sustainable development trajectory. There is the Paris Climate Agreement, which is supposed to be the 5th year after the 2015 agreement, but because it was delayed, It will take place in November in Glasgow, Scotland. Then there is the meeting on the Convention on Biodiversity, which will take place in China, in Kunming in May. There will be the World Food System Summit, which will be convened by Secretary General Guterres at UN headquarters in September. And there will be the World Oceans Summit for Sustainable Management of the Oceans in Portugal, in Lisbon, in April. So there is the makings of global cooperation. And I would like to see each of those regions come forward to say, like the European Green Deal, an ASEAN Green Deal or a South Asian Green Deal or an African Union Green Deal, we have a plan, we have a technology pathway, we have a financing strategy to reach each of those major transformation areas. Let me conclude by talking about the culture and ethics of sustainable development. Can we help all people and all countries to come to a common understanding of what we need? That's a huge undertaking. If we spend most of our time arguing and fighting with each other, then the answer is no. If we believe that people are so fundamentally different that we are inevitably going to have a war of civilizations, then obviously the answer would be no. I think that that is a terrible mistake to believe that there is some intrinsic barrier to civilizational cooperation. But we have been at civilizational conflict for a long time. Some of it is very deep-seated in our cultures. And some of it is deep-seated in our psychology, because human psychology is primed to view others as an enemy or as a threat. And this is a very deep-seated part of social psychology. So the question for me is, can we find a global culture and ethics to underpin sustainable development? And I would start by saying that we already have one important foundation, and that is the globally agreed framework of human rights. And that is in the form of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is sometimes called the United Nations Moral Charter. It was adopted in 1948, adopted by all countries of the world. It starts by saying that every human being is endowed with human dignity. And because of that dignity, has basic rights, including civil rights and including economic rights. The right to food, the right to social protection, the right to a safe environment, the right to health, and the right to education. And all countries have adopted this. I believe that that is a building block for us to have the underpinnings of the global goal of reaching sustainable development. Then we have, in principle, the commitment to global peace, though we're not very good at living up to it. The idea of a global peace, well, the first idea of the global peace that I know of is Isaiah chapter 2. When the prophet Isaiah says that the swords shall be beat into plowshares and the spears into pruning hooks. So it is Isaiah chapter 2, verse 4, that is probably our first vision of global peace. Our first modern vision of global peace is a famous essay by philosopher Immanuel Kant in 1795 called Perpetual Peace, where he said the way to perpetual peace is a world of republics that are linked together in commerce. Because he said it's the kings that send the young off to war and to die almost as sport. So he said we need a republican vision that takes seriously life and that takes seriously the benefit of peace. Now, that was written in 1795. It was precisely 150 years later, in 1945, that the world adopted the UN Charter. And that charter was adopted at the end of World War II to stop future war. And we're now in the 75th anniversary of the UN Charter, which I regard as a fundamental pillar for sustainable development. A third direction, common direction, I would say, is combining science and faith in human progress. And I believe people around the world have religious convictions. We live in an age of science. These are sometimes seen as completely at odds with each other. It is one of the wonders of the modern Roman Catholic Church that they are seen as completely in line with each other. And I do believe that the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas, which is both a Christian and an Aristotelian philosophy, and then adopted in the Church's modern social teachings, is a philosophy that combines science and faith. It's embodied in the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, which is a cutting-edge scientific institution at the service of the Pope. But it illustrates for me that we also don't have that conflict. Now, that's not true everywhere, because the United States, for example, has a fundamentalist religious part of our society, which is anti-scientific, and therefore doesn't believe in climate change, and really doesn't believe very strongly in higher education at all. And here we do face a challenge of fundamentalisms. And I believe that we need to create and foster a culture that is not fundamentalist, but a culture in which science and religious beliefs can be seen to be living in active harmony rather than in open conflict. It is, to my mind, part of achieving sustainable development. What enables us to have the shining light of Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si, for example, which is a wonderful document of science and a wonderful document of moral philosophy and a wonderful document of Catholic theology, all together and all consistent. The next part of building that culture is part of the Sustainable Development Goals, actually Target 4.7. It says that we need education in sustainable development and in global citizenship all over the world. I believe that education is our best hope for ending up with sustainable development rather than with dystopia. And so I put my confidence in education as the way to cultivate the rational spirit and the knowledge and the citizenship to achieve sustainable development. And Target 4.7 of the Sustainable Development Goals says that every child should receive an education in sustainable development and in global citizenship. And just 2 days ago at the Vatican, we launched actually Mission 4.7, connecting the Vatican, UNESCO, the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, Ban Ki-moon, and others in a partnership for education for sustainable development. Another step on this way of creating a culture and ethics of sustainable development is the network of universities. I believe that universities have played a decisive role in human society for the good for a long time, and that we have a special responsibility today to be training our students and doing the analysis and the research on how to end up on the sustainable development trajectory rather than on the dystopian pathway, and that by networking together, we can strengthen that resolve. I've been asked by Secretary General Ban Ki-moon originally in 2012, and then again by our current Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, to lead an effort we call SDSN, the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. And that is to bring universities together on behalf of sustainable development. And University of Rome is one of the world's great universities, and I'm sure that I can count on University of Rome playing a global leadership role in helping students everywhere to understand the potential and the practicalities and the manageability of sustainable development. Finally, I want to say our end purpose, because I think that this is lost in neoclassical economics. You know, when ethics started, modern ethics started with Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle in the Western tradition. Well, I call it modern ethics, but ethics in the Western philosophy started 2,300 years ago, 2,400 years ago with Socrates. And the idea was, what do we need to flourish as human beings? How do we achieve a good life? And for the Greeks, the good life, the flourishing life, or sometimes just summarized as happiness, is called eudaimonia, the good spirit of life. And that was taken by Aristotle to be the end purpose of life, the telos, the objective, the unfolding, the realization of our potential. And I believe that this is the correct way to understand ethics, that ethics is the science of understanding the human good and how to achieve it. As I've been describing, I believe that the human good for our time is embodied in the idea of sustainable development, because that aims for the kind of society in which people can flourish, in which people can be materially safe, the planet can be safe, and we can have a society that is a shared prosperity and a society of trust rather than conflict. So I would regard sustainable development as our telos, as our purpose. Somewhere along the way in economics, we lost the idea of telos or purpose. Instead, we said maximize utility, but we didn't really say what utility is, what well-being is, how to achieve well-being. And so we stopped analyzing well-being and basically took the idea that whatever people do, that's their telos, and don't argue with it. And I think that that was a big mistake. If we go back to the idea of what is human thriving and how to achieve it, how to have societies that are just, how to have individuals that are both trusting and trustworthy, how to have objectives for society that take care of the vulnerable and the poor, and to protect the planet, then we will be getting back to the idea of purpose and telos. And I know that this was one of the themes of Professor Caffè, who believed that we need ethics as inseparable from technique, that economics and ethics could not be divided, but joined together. And I want to end there with that agreement of belief, that statement that by focusing on what is important for us for our thriving and well-being, we'll find the path to get there. And to thank you for inviting me to give this year's Federico Caffè lectures. Thank you so much.
Facciamo qualche mascherina?
And I will try to stop sharing the screen so I appear again. There I am.
Okay, Jeffrey. Thank you so much. I speak Italian. Grazie mille. Non so come chiamarlo, questo sopralluogo sul sentiero della grande trasformazione sopralluogo dettagliato, straordinario, anche emozionante, devo dire. Ne voglia quasi di scendere per strada e cominciare a fare qualcosa. Vabbè, comunque, ci ho detto, passo la parola a Mario Tiberi, che dovrebbe avere il compito di convogliare le domande.
Posso parlare? Sì, sì. Mi sentite?
Sì.
Sì. Allora,
Yes.
mi dispiace che questa modalità online non consente di gratificare il nostro ospite con l'applauso che sicuramente sarebbe stato se fosse stato in presenza di un'aula piuttosto numerosa. Comunque sono gli inconvenienti di questa modalità e comunque ci ha consentito di ascoltare queste interessanti lezioni del professor Sachs. Allora, prima di passare alle domande, due brevissime comunicazioni. Una soprattutto per gli studenti della nostra facoltà che hanno il compito di preparare un breve paper sulle lezioni del professor Sachs. Allora, ricordo loro che questo paper può essere preparato in italiano, inglese o spagnolo. Poi avremo le diapositive del professor Sachs sul sito del nostro dipartimento e credo che sarà anche possibile avere la registrazione delle lezioni sul sito del dipartimento, quindi questo per agevolare il compito dei nostri studenti. Un'altra breve informazione che naturalmente i scritti del professor Sachs in inglese li trovate sul suo sito molto agevolmente, ma mi piace informarvi che esistono due pubblicazioni recenti in italiano del professor Sachs a cura della Lewis University Press. I titoli sono, vi dico rapidamente, America 2030 e l'altro Terra, Popoli, Macchine. Però ripeto, Lewis University Press, Jeffrey Sachs. E adesso passiamo alle domande. Vi invito tutti a essere pertinenti o anche impertinenti, ma essere piuttosto brevi per usare al meglio questo tempo che ci è rimasto. E per cortesia verso l'ospite inviterei chi prende la parola a dire brevemente la sua qualifica, studente, docente, non serve un curriculum. Allora, detto questo, io avevo già una prenotazione del professor Ciccarone che può prendere. Che succede?
No, si è tolto.
Non c'è più?
No.
Thank you, Mario, but I don't think I asked for a reserved question.
No, allora, bene, allora...
It was not me.
Excuse me, may I?
Possiamo stare al prossimo. Allora abbiamo Sara Mood.
Yes. Yes. So it's me again, Sarah Hamoud. First of all, I would like to thank you so much for this amazing presentation. It was really very interesting. And for the question, so capitalism has showed us how exploitative, unstable, and unsustainable it is, and technically has failed and created inequalities, making the rich richer and the poor poorer. And now the pandemic has intensified the crises. So I wanted to know, are we now gonna do capitalism differently, like adopting a new structure of it, or are we heading towards more of a mixed new Keynesian system, allowing the sustainable development that we talked about? And if this is the case, won't the bourgeoisie and powerful countries fight it to prevent it from happening? Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. Capitalism is a big term that needs to be really parsed carefully. It means, broadly speaking, organization of the economy through private ownership, largely of corporate form. And as a broad rubric, it is definitely the dominant form of economic organization. But in fact, of course, every economy on the planet is some kind of mixed economy where part of production is corporate form, privately owned. Part of production is government. Part of production is non-market. Part of production is civil society or cooperative or charitable or some other way. And in all countries, part of market earnings are taxed, and government directly provides services or transfers income as a part of fundamental economic practice. So in no economy in the world does the market, as in the capitalist ideal form, allocate all resources. And in some capitalist economies, like Northern Europe, in fact, like Europe in general, but especially Northern Europe, roughly 50% of the national production is taxed and either transferred or used to fund social consumption, meaning government provided schools, government provided hospitals and clinics, government provided recreation, government provided housing, and so on. All of this is to say that we all live in mixed economies with the different proportions of the mix between public, private, voluntary, household, not-for-profit. And it's very useful to study that mix, to understand differences across countries, and to come up with some judgment about what works better in what circumstances. So to my mind, the most successful countries in the world right now, economically speaking, the ones that are closest to sustainable development, are the Northern European social democracies. They're not perfect, but I would say Iceland, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Finland have a lot of very desirable operating characteristics in that they are very prosperous. They are all rather green, but aiming to achieve zero net emissions well before 2050. The inequalities of income are rather low because there's a strong socialization of consumption. Everybody gets basically the same healthcare. Everybody gets basically the same education. Not quite, but to a significant extent. There's lots of social housing and so forth. Now, a very different kind of capitalism is the United States, where the social component of consumption is quite low. Inequality is very high. There are lots of social needs that are unaddressed. And the political economy is very different in that government is plutocratic, corrupt, and largely driven by industrial lobbies, and up until recently by the fossil fuel lobby. So the US is, I would say, almost exhibit A of the dystopian direction, whereas the Northern European economies are much more along the sustainable development direction. I think they get much better eudaimonic outcomes as a result of that. Their happiness is higher, the life expectancy is longer, the social conflicts are much reduced. They don't end up with the leaders like Donald Trump, who is as much a symptom as he is a cause in the United States. He's a symptom of a broken political system, after all. He was chosen, not quite by a majority, but by enough people that shows you something seriously wrong in the United States that could have such a psychopathic person be chosen as a president. I mean, someone so vulgar and obviously immoral and unethical chosen as a leader. So I believe that when we talk about this, a mixed economic system has a lot of desirable features because it does give some freedom. It does give scope for innovation, for entrepreneurship, for individual choice, to avoid the suffocating bureaucracy of a fully state-owned system. But on the other hand, it avoids some of the worst abuse. I mean, the social democratic variant of this avoids the worst abuses of the plutocratic capitalism of the United States. So in this sense, I would like us to move more towards the social democratic ethos. I would call it in general the sustainable development ethos, but I would say that a mixed economy is definitely what we have in mind, and we should be delving in depth into what mix is the most propitious mix for different parts of the economy, for health and education, public, for running a lot of small businesses, private, and so forth.
Dunque, io non vedo altre domande per ora, anche se sulla chat apparivano alcune domande durante l'esposizione del professor Sachs. Allora, in attesa che qualcuno si faccia coraggio e venga avanti, faccio io una domanda al professor Sachs. Dunque, non credi che all'interno della tua Great Transformation un posto importante debba avere una riforma incisiva della corporate governance? In particolare penso al potere enorme che hanno le imprese multinazionali.
So we obviously have a very obvious and difficult problem, which is that the multinational companies became very powerful compared to our governments because they could move capital, they could make threats. In the United States, they could buy power. And the result is that companies have overweening influence. At the same time, we can still see that government, when it is charged with or takes the responsibility for end goals, can still have the power over companies. And I would say that Europe's vision of sustainable development and of the digital responsibility with the recent initiatives on digital management and digital transparency and accountability are examples of regulation of powerful companies. Now, it's probably true that Europe is regulating the big tech mainly because those big tech companies are not European companies. You know, Europe is regulating Google and Apple and Amazon and so forth, probably because it knows that it should, which is absolutely correct, and because these are American companies, maybe it's politically easier. And I strongly support the European initiatives on this. Washington has not had the guts to take on the big tech industries. And so we don't have that kind of regulation. Maybe it's similar, not quite the same, when it comes to climate change and decarbonization. Europe is in the lead of decarbonization, but probably because the fossil fuel industry sector is much weaker in Europe. Of course, there are European leaders in hydrocarbons like BP or Shell or ENI or others, but it's true that the political weight of these companies is much less than Chevron and Exxon in the United States, probably because of relative size and also regulatory history and so forth. So this question of how to regulate the big companies is quite real, and it can't be done country by country. you need at least the scale of the European Union, but even that's not enough. We need to have global tax rules, which we don't have right now. And that means we need global cooperation. And what happened? Well, we assigned that to OECD. OECD helped to put together a reformist agenda of corporate taxation. And then the United States under Trump blocked it because Trump was just representing US corporate interests because of the dominance of US corporate power in Washington. Let's try again this coming year with Biden. It's really important that we get this global agreement on corporate taxation, on ending tax havens, on corporate disclosure, on rules of the digital economy. And this is part of our big challenge because of the power of these companies. It's also a reason why I want to bring China into this as well, because I don't think we're going to make it in a divided world with multiple sets of standards. We really do want WTO or WIPO or the ITU. In other words, the global normative regulatory bodies creating global standards, but of course based on sustainable development.
Dunque, sono contento che il mio esempio abbia funzionato, perché adesso abbiamo 4 domande che per la verità a questo punto sono un po' troppe che per i tempi che abbiamo a disposizione, quindi però vorremmo esaurire tutte e 4 le domande. Allora invitare i richiedenti ad essere veramente incisivi nelle loro domande. Prego, il primo è Francesco.
Yes. Sì. My name is Francesco. I'm an economics student at Sapienza.
Great.
And I want to thank you, Professor Sachs, for this motivating lesson. And I want to ask you in the specific, what do you think about political risks of Silk Road Initiative? I mean, is China really interested in a good project, or it's only a new form of colonialism with the good mask of sustainability?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. I think in general, well, actually, let me start by saying colonialism was a system of direct power and conquest, and a quite brutal system, of course, at that. It meant really the imposition of sovereignty. It could be direct rule or it could be indirect rule by overturning governments, like the United States has liked to do when the leader doesn't conform to US interests, often US corporate interests, overthrow the government, like we did in Guatemala or in Iran in 1953. Or it could be a direct military rule, like European imperial power in Africa and in Asia in the 19th century up till World War II, basically. I don't think that China's behavior is anything like that. And God help us if it became that, but I don't see any intention for that to be the case either. China definitely would like more influence diplomatically in the world, no question. China often wants to ingratiate itself, or Chinese leaders to ingratiate themselves with other countries, or to make purely commercial bargains irrespective of who is in charge. And China has interests in securing resources or influence. But that's a long way from imperialism or colonialism, which is a much more brutal, violence-based strategy, which is not the Belt and Road. Then one could ask, what is the motive for China? And I think the motive is basically an economic and diplomatic motive. The economic motive has two parts. One, to make Chinese economy more productive and make it more productive by internationalizing production more. This is what the United States did after World War II. It's not unfamiliar, and it makes a lot of sense to have infrastructure which stretches across Asia, Southeast Asia, and so on, and also means a lot of exports of Chinese technology and infrastructure in these countries. I don't see anything adverse to that if the projects are good and decent projects. I think the biggest problem with the Belt and Road Initiative is that it's chosen a lot of mediocre projects which have been politically motivated by the requesting governments, but not very well thought out in terms of the longer term sustainable development agenda. So probably not the best transport choices, not the best corridor choices, too much fossil fuel investment that I think will not pay off. And China could end up losing a lot of money on these investments because these are loans by and large, and the loans, when they go bad, mean that the loans turn into grants in effect, and that will happen for some of this investment. But having said all of that, the basic concept of the Belt and Road Initiative is a right concept, which is to strengthen the infrastructure, especially of Eurasia, and also of the Indian Ocean region to a significant extent, including East Africa. But it should be done in a green and digital way because Eurasia needs this interconnection, and having fast electric rail between Europe and China is good. It's an efficient form of freight and people, actually. It is also much lower emissions. Having a fiber backbone across Eurasia is important. Having a renewable energy interconnected grid, as I suggested, is absolutely part of decarbonization. So I'm a supporter of the Belt and Road Initiative, but I've said from the beginning that for China's own sake, as well as for the receiving countries, it should be much more systematic to be for sustainable infrastructure. And that means largely renewable energy, digital, smart transport. And if it is, and that's the new announcements are moving much more in that direction. I think China got the message first that it was going to lose a lot of money on bad investments, which is expensive. And second, that in a world that needs to decarbonize, you can't have the Belt and Road Initiative going off in a fossil fuel direction. In general, this is a very big question for humanity, but I do not believe that China is a militarily aggressive power. I don't think it has been that way in its history, and I don't think it is that way in the 21st century. China does not have military bases around the world. It's got one tiny little base in Djibouti, a naval station. It basically does not have overseas bases. It wants security. And what it faces from the United States is about 800 offshore international military bases of the United States all over Asia, Africa, the Middle East, Europe, and so on. So I find it ironic that the United States points the finger at China and says, oh, you see what a threat. But the United States has about 800 overseas bases. It has 6,000 nuclear warheads. It spends vastly more on the military than China. And then it points the finger at China. And by the way, and the US also says to China, I mean, the right wing of the United States, like Pompeo, says to China, we're going to contain you. And so I see China's reaction as a reaction, not as a sign of aggression. And from what I understand of China's history, China has not been for hundreds of years, has not fought overseas wars. It's been involved in, as far as I know, one overseas war in the last half century, and that's Vietnam in a couple of years, and not one single war in the last 40 years. Whereas the United States is a nonstop war machine, I'm afraid, and we're trying to stop it all the time. So in this sense, I'd rather go with the route of cooperation, and I'd rather put China to the test of sustainable development. And I like Europe's approach. I think Europe should say to China, we want to cooperate, but we want to cooperate on a sustainable development, multilateral, peaceful, rule-based approach. And that could be very, I think, very much along the lines that I've been speaking of the sustainable development trajectory.
Thank you so much.
Deve assumere un ruolo in grado di interrompere questa conversazione, perché abbiamo una ragione tecnica molto forte, che è quella della nostra facoltà dove stiamo parlando, che chiude inesorabilmente alle 20. Però c'è un rimedio, spero che sia tecnicamente possibile. Siccome è previsto uno straordinario di un'ora, durante la quale il professor Sachs incontrerà, sempre tramite computer, i nostri dottorandi, io credo sia tecnicamente possibile che coloro che hanno intenzione di fare una domanda possano tenere il loro collegamento anche successivamente. Credo non ci siano difficoltà tecniche. In ogni caso, come ultima chance, c'è anche l'alternativa di scrivere un'email al professor Sachs, che sono sicuro avrà piacere di rispondere. E scusate, ma devo fare questa cosa per ragioni di forza maggiore, anche perché era previsto un breve intervento di chiusura del professor Franzini, a cui adesso devo cedere la parola.
Grazie di corsa, perché mi pare che altrimenti Mario Ribelli rimane chiuso nella facoltà e non è una bella cosa. Allora volevo ringraziare davvero Jeffrey Sachs per queste due lezioni. Vorrei aggiungere una piccola cosa che è la seguente. Spesso ci capita di sentirci chiedere ma che cosa avrebbe detto Caffè se ci fosse? E io in genere a queste domande rispondo ma avrebbe detto cose che non siamo in grado di prevedere, ci avrebbe sorpresi. Invece questa volta faccio una previsione, dico che sarebbe stato molto contento di questa lezione di Sachs. Ci direbbe, beh, bravi i miei ex giovani allievi che hanno scelto bene, mi è piaciuta questa lezione e me la sono meritata. Quindi questo penso di poterlo dire con una certa ragionevole certezza. In conclusione si fanno i ringraziamenti doverosi, e quindi il primo ringraziamento ovviamente è a Jeffrey Sachs, al quale scriverò anch'io per alcune domande, sperando che mi voglia rispondere. Ringraziamenti vanno anche a tutti coloro che hanno reso possibili queste lezioni, a cominciare dalla Banca d'Italia, che come sempre non ha fatto mancare il suo sostegno a questa iniziativa, e siamo molto grati al governatore e a tutti coloro che in qualche modo hanno contribuito a darci questo importantissimo sostegno. I ringraziamenti vanno agli staff tecnici, al personale del Dipartimento. I ringraziamenti vanno a tutti i partecipanti e alla nostra interprete che ha svolto il suo lavoro in maniera eccellente. Spero di non aver dimenticato nessuno, ma se l'ho dimenticato già da adesso lo ringrazio, quindi lo saprà che è stato ringraziato. L'appuntamento è per il prossimo anno, ma devo anche ringraziare naturalmente Mario Tiberi, che come John Fitzgerald Kennedy ha un goal preciso, che è quello ogni anno di fare la lezione caffè e ci tortura in qualche modo finché non abbiamo realizzato questo goal, quindi anche nel 2021 saremo torturati a questo scopo, ma con grande piacere. Speriamo di poterci vedere di persona e magari, visto il desiderio di Jeffrey di venire a Roma, lo invitiamo come ospite questa volta nella Caffè Lecture del 2021. Ok? Quindi grazie davvero tante, saluti a tutti e quindi provate a continuare, come diceva Mario Tiberi, coloro che hanno domande, provate a continuare con il collegamento riservato, e che era inizialmente riservato agli studenti del dottorato. Arrivederci a tutti e grazie.
Do we stay on the line now or do I reconnect?
I don't know. Mario?
Sei connesso, Jeffrey? Poi you can speak, Jeffrey.
Yes, I was asking whether I stay on this line or reconnect on a different line.
No, the same line.
Okay, good. Can we take a 2-minute break then?
Of course, this was my idea. Just the rest, 5 minutes rest, 10 minutes rest. After
Excellent.
that, you come back with us. Okay.
I'll be back in just a few minutes then.
Thank you again from me as well, Jeffrey.
Thank you.
Allora, possiamo chiudere qui.
Ciao a tutti. Allora aspettiamo 10 minuti.
Ah, forse perché...
Sette partecipanti, che cosa dice?
Cosa stai vedendo? Alle scema.
Non sto a capire.
One more minute, if that's okay.
Okay.
Davide.
Hello.
Lo sai. Allora, senti,
Tante da un saluto.
questo è successo a Magellan.
Hello, Jeffrey. Are you there?
Hi.
Hi.
Oh, sorry.
So,
4 minutes.
yeah, of course.
Yeah, per video.
Great, I'll be in just 1 minute. Hi.
Hello, hi.
How are you?
Hi, fine. So, good evening to everybody. Massimiliano Tancioni speaking. I'm a professor of economic policy at Sapienza, the University of Rome, and I'm the director of the Sapienza PhD in economics. So I have the honor to introduce Professor Jeffrey Sachs to our PhD students. This is my duty now. So first of all, I have to express my own and the PhD teaching board's thanks to Jeffrey Sachs for his availability. And I will be really short in this introduction, as I have to leave space to our students. I think this will be much more effective than an introduction. So this is what I will do. I'm sure that Professor Sachs will understand that his stand does not need other introduction. This is my thought. So please don't be shy. This is something that I'm saying to our students. Don't be shy and join this meeting. And so I leave space to our students to make questions or exchange point of views with Professor Jeffrey Sachs. Thank you a lot for you being here with us. Thank you.
My pleasure, my great pleasure, and really eager to hear about students' interests, questions. That's great.
So you can raise your hand, and okay, there is here Stefano Berti, no, Ridolfi has a raised hand. So I don't know if there is a way to make this question.
Yeah, probably unmute and speak. Does that work?
Let me check.
Yes, I'm here. Do you hear
Great.
me?
I hear you.
Yes, thanks a lot really for everything, and it's really an honor to be.
Oops. I was hearing you, Samuele, if you could try again.
I'm sorry, I was kicked out. Sorry, I don't know why. My question was, what do you think about the deal made by Germany? Thanks to
I'm sorry, say it again.
The deal made by Germany with Poland and Hungary, and thanks to Merkel on the veto upon the next generation balance, and the effects that it will have on the SDGs, and especially on the human rights violation.
In other words, yeah, I wish I knew enough to tell you. I did not follow closely enough in the last few days because it's been also incredibly complicated time in the U.S. with our politics. So I know that the deal was made on the questions of democratic practice in Poland and Hungary to slow down the review. I can't really tell you the consequences of it because I don't really know the details well enough. What I could tell you, maybe of some interest, is that I worked closely with the Polish government in 1989 to 1992 for the early reform period after the fall of the communist regime and the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I was a very strong proponent of Poland becoming a member of Europe. And I was very much in favor of quick expansion of the European Union. So it hasn't exactly worked out fully the way that I hoped politically. I would say it worked out economically somewhat like I foresaw, because I believe that by opening Europe, there would be a faster convergence of living standards, in fact, a quick convergence of living standards between the former Eastern communist countries and the rest of Europe. And when Poland started its economic reforms in 1990, the Polish per capita income measured at purchasing power prices was about 1/3 of the level of Germany. And today in 2020, it is about 2/3 of the level of Germany. So there's been a quite fast convergence. That's over a period of 30 years. But Poland went from being 1/3 the income level of Germany to 2/3. And I'd say that that's good progress. But it also has been accompanied by quite an interesting political turn against those who led the liberalization. And the government has been consistently a more right-wing nationalist government in recent years, much less to my own preferences. And I don't really understand why, I have to say. It's my own limitation, but the sociology of that change is not really clear to me. But it reflects, of course, a division in Polish society of the same kind of division we find in most of our societies, between more rural conservative voters and more progressive urban voters. I think it's a division that's fairly common. And it's not wonderful because the anti-European sentiment expressed by Poland and by Hungary is very distasteful to me, especially since I've seen the whole perspective of the days when people were risking their lives to join Europe. And the whole slogan of the 1989 revolution was the return to Europe. And maybe one more anecdote that I can share is that in 1989, a young man, Hungarian young man, came to see me in my home in Boston, Massachusetts. And we spent a day together talking about the future of Hungary. He was a liberal, very much a Democrat, very much in favor of market economic reforms, very progressive attitudes. And we spent a day together and I was very much impressed. That was 1989. No, that was 1990, sorry. You might guess who that was. That was Viktor Orban when he was a young man. And he was very different from the Viktor Orban of today. And this is also part of life, how politics evolves in this way.
Thank you a lot, really. Really, thank you a lot for everything.
So thank you for this answer. Is there someone else?
May I ask you some question, Professor? I'm
Of
Francesca.
course. Hi, Francesca.
Thank you for your great presentation. I have two very brief questions. The first one is about housing. If in this sustainable development model, there is something about, for instance, our Italian model of house ownership, if this can be sustainable in the future and for the whole planet, or maybe our rent model is better. And the second question is about something you said in yesterday's presentation about population growth. I like to know if population growth as it is today or as it may be in the future is completely not compatible with this model, if it has to change, and also if this has to change not only for Africa, but also for the other parts of the world.
Yeah. Can you describe to me which part of the Italian housing policies you're thinking of?
No, it's just not policies, but our culture, maybe, according to which we desire to buy a house rather than to just rent one.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I think that we will move increasingly towards rental markets rather than ownership. In the United States, the dream is home ownership, but for urban life, it's not. And we built a suburban America with the idea that everybody would live in the suburb and would drive their car to work, and we created an automobile-based society, which is definitely hugely expensive and hugely problematic, where car ownership has to be very high. The costs of maintenance are quite high. And I suspect that this is certainly not going to be the model of developing countries in the future. The big question for urban life, I think probably the main question for urban life is the density of urban settlements, whether we're going to have highly dense urban settlements in the future and big cities with concentrated populations, or whether they will be more spread out. The argument has been that that dense urban settlements like New York or Rome make sense because there are large economies of scale. to be achieved by concentrations of population. I happen to think also high quality of life is achieved this way. The counter argument is that with the digital revolution, people can live anywhere and work anywhere, and will choose now to actually, since they don't have to commute anymore, necessarily go to work, the digital world will favor a more dispersed population where you work from wherever you are. And the idea of a center city or central business district will be eliminated by technology. I don't know how I feel about this debate. Tomorrow I'm hosting a meeting of urban specialists to talk about exactly this question. Will technology and quality of life issues lead us to more and more concentration and densification, where we can walk to where we want to be, where we can be among shops, green areas, and so forth? Or will the logic of the digital revolution lead us to more dispersed settlements? I still tend to believe it's the former, but I'm waiting to hear what the urban specialists and the urban planners think about this issue. I do think that we're moving more towards a share economy, an Airbnb economy, a car share economy, and a residential share economy, because that also seems to me to be more in line with the digital world and the new possibilities of matching users and uses of capital more efficiently. I also hope that it means much less car ownership, because the US model of needing to own 2 cars per household is both very expensive and very wasteful, and in my view, very unsustainable. And I love living in Manhattan, in New York City, without a car, because you certainly don't need a car here, and you can't even afford a car in the center of the city. And so in this sense, I think there is a better way. But I'll summarize by saying that how cities will evolve in the future is a great research topic and a great issue of sustainability, because cities change as transport and communications technology change. And we lived in the automobile age for the 20th century. Now we're living in the digital age and the autonomous vehicle age, most likely, and so forth. And this will restructure our cities, especially the cities in developing countries that still are to be laid out. And I think that it's a great topic for analysis, but I don't think we have a clear and definitive picture about it. And then the second question you asked me, if you could remind me one more time, sorry.
Yes, of course. Thank you for the answer. The second question is about population growth.
Oh, population, yeah.
Yes,
so,
yeah.
So I think the issue of population is basically two sides. On one side, there is very rapid population growth still in Africa, with fertility rates above 4. And then in Italy, most of Europe, most of the high income countries, the fertility rate is far below replacement, 1.4, 1.3. And the question is, what will happen then? Because if you manage a low fertility rate for the long future, the population really shrinks a lot over 3 or 4 generations. So what the United Nations Population Division assumes, but it's only an assumption, is that there is a reversion in the long term to the replacement rate, which is roughly 2, tiny bit above 2 because of the infant mortality rate. So you need 2 children basically for population stability. And the UN assumes that total fertility rates will converge over the course of the 21st century to 2. And that means that in places like Italy, where the population growth is very low, the fertility rate will tend to rise. And then in places like sub-Saharan Africa, where the fertility rate is very high, it will tend to fall. And all of the different variants of that are the speed of convergence to the level of 2. There's no deep reason why that should be the case. There's no deep reason why the low fertility in Italy should rise to 2, because 2 is not biologically or economically the necessary equilibrium point. And just as we had generations of much higher fertility than 2, we could have generations of lower fertility than 2. There's nothing that says that the Earth's population should stabilize at 9 billion, for example, which is what the long-term scenario assumes, roughly speaking. You know, it was 900 million 2 centuries ago. It rose to 9 billion. Why should it stay at 9 billion? Maybe Earth would be simpler, more sustainable, higher quality of life if there was a gradual decline of population to 5 or 6 billion people. Perfectly possible. So we're not very good at determining the long-term tendencies. The general model that you move from high fertility to low fertility has played out in every part of the world except for Africa right now. The idea that we converge to a level of 2 sometime within 2 or 3 generations is just a guess, not anything that could be proven as the stable equilibrium. And all things considered, it will be hard to achieve sustainable development with 9 billion people. It will be easier with 8 billion people. It will be easier still with 7 billion people. We want to get there voluntarily and with a quality of life, not through a disaster, God forbid. But this very large population that Earth has is something new. When I was born, the Earth's population was less than 3 billion people. Now it's 8 billion people. That was over my lifetime. And it's completely arbitrary, and it's made life much more complicated to try to feed, provision, and meet the living standard objectives of 8 billion people is what I was talking about the last 2 days, and not so easy to achieve. Not impossible, but not easy.
Thank you very much.
Hello, Professor Sachs. Thank you for this beautiful presentation. I think the first step to look for sustainable goals is to have sustainable people. Do you think nowadays, with the increasing suicide rates and depression due to social media and virtual life, everyday life is sustainable? What do you think about the huge power of influence the owners of these platforms have? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much. It is perverse, of course, that we are the beneficiaries of the most remarkable scientific advances and breakthroughs, and yet we don't turn them very reliably to quality of life. And that, in fact, as I mentioned in my talk, almost every technology has at least 2 deliberate sides to it: a peaceful side and a deliberate militarization of technology, and that's happening with these technologies. But there are also, of course, the hidden costs of these technologies also. And we're learning that the digital technologies are opening up many new channels of difficulty and pain. As you mentioned, there's evidence, though it's much debated, but there is evidence that shows something that, at least for adolescents, using social media is pretty depressing. And the more that it's used, the more depressing, creating anxiety, false comparisons, tremendous peer pressures of a new kind, now a technology-based variety. We're seeing that the technologies are manipulated, of course, whether it's hacking, fake news, hidden persuasion, and so on. And this is something that our models, you know, our economic models and our vision of society have not properly grappled with. All of the techniques of manipulation. It's been a theme, I would say, maybe for 60 years in social criticism, the role of advertising in society. It has been a theme since Plato, the role of demagogues in society, and Aristotle, the art of persuasion by demagogues. But the ability of demagogues to use new technologies like radio broadcast or movies or television. Hitler made, of course, huge uses of the new broadcast media for his persuasive powers and devastating consequences. And now the social media, you know, is showing again new kinds of manipulation. And what is really depressing for me about this is, even if you're a pretty close observer of this as I am, I think at least I don't understand how a lot of this manipulation actually works. And what I find incredible is, while Europe is trying to regulate this, in the United States, we can't even organize a sensible, honest investigation or debate about what our big social media companies are actually doing, how they operate, what they do with our data, how intrusive they are, and so on. So a lot of what's happening is hidden from view. I learned a long time ago that the US government almost never tells the truth about anything. And when Edward Snowden revealed how much spying the US was doing on US citizens and how much interception of data and so forth, he had to flee for his life. And there was never a follow-up of public disclosure of any of this. And so we never had a proper debate. The only debate was whether Snowden should be shot or hanged for what he did, not applauded for telling us something. And there was no follow-up to explain any of this. So in this sense, this is a real problem, coming to grips with how our deeper values are shaped or distorted, and how our well-being is manipulated or undermined by these technologies. You know, at the same time, these technologies could do amazingly good if we use them in the right way. Because these technologies, my guess is that just the mobile phone has probably done as much to reduce child mortality in Africa as any direct health intervention. Because suddenly people in remote villages can get some help in an emergency, which was not possible even 10 years ago. And so just the flow of information should be potentially hugely empowering. And what if we designed these technologies for the public benefit? What if we really thought about the ethical underpinnings and the goals that we have, and then used a design format and framework to pursue particular goals? That's what I believe we should do. I once proposed this to a senior Facebook executive, and I was basically laughed out of the office. I was told, well, that's not Mark Zuckerberg's interest. And I said, it has to be Mark Zuckerberg's interest. You have more than 2 billion users. You have to be interested. And they told me, sorry, go to Washington. Don't come here to talk about this. Go, that's for policy, not for a business. And I told them that they should pay more taxes, then governments would be able to do more. And that was the end of the discussion. So the bottom line is that you're, of course, right, that we're in a deep technological change. There are unintended consequences and there are intended consequences. And the unintended consequences are still a bit of a mystery. The implications for our well-being of using these technologies. The intended consequences have two parts. One is the intention for militarization. I'm sure that's dangerous. And the second is the intention for manipulation. And I'm also sure that that's very dangerous. And we should be very attentive to this. And I appreciate that the European Union, more than any other political body in the world, is pushing in the right direction.
Thank you so much.
Hello, Professor. Thank you so much for your lecture. I have a question concerning the business level. Yeah. You just mentioned that about Facebook, and I think it was a very good example. You're as well elevating during your lecture the relevance and the great achievements of Nordic countries, and I totally agree. They are leading in the SDGs race. However, for example, today, because I'm following Nordic countries quite closely, today there was a discussion. One of the newspapers published an article claiming that the oil and gas business, which of course Norway is living on that, is going to thrive for quite some time because renewables are still kind of, although there is a lot of research and there is a lot of going forward, it looks like it's going to be still for quite some time with us. And then the whole LinkedIn discussion of oil and gas managers, like, fantastic, that's a Christmas gift for us, we're so happy. And it was like, everybody was ecstatic about it. That's one part. The second part came actually from Denmark, that they are very high.
Not from Denmark. Oh my God.
The second part come from Denmark, and they had, there was another article that was published, and it was research of the biggest 20 companies of Denmark. And that was actually pointing out that the biggest 20 companies of Denmark are having problems reporting on climate concerning the how to say, concerning the footprint, the carbon footprint. Yep. So it looks like if those businesses that we would think the Nordic countries and the biggest businesses and the oil and gas, that is of course per se very problematic. I mean, it looks like they don't have the incentive. Of course, as the subject is very trendy, that's how they see it. They want to do it because of the markets. They want to do for the investments. There is a lot of pressure as well from the public and the stakeholders, but there is not still good enough. It's far from it. How to mobilize businesses?
Good. So good questions. I'll bet. I will bet, but and then I'll explain why. But I'll bet that before 2050, Norway doesn't produce any natural gas anymore, or basically is at zero, almost zero, let's say, and that carbon emissions in the Scandinavian countries is at zero. Let's take the positive side. Copenhagen says that it's going, the city of Copenhagen claims it's going carbon free, I think by 2025, if I'm not mistaken, but all electric and basically all renewable very soon. A lot of Nordic cities are moving quickly in that direction. It is true in Denmark, I think it is a fact that Denmark has actually created a very profitable and good niche in wind power, of course, starting with Vestas and some others, that is a major export sector. And I think that that is both real and will propel this decarbonization pathway. Norway is a little bit complicated. It's the greenest hydrocarbon-based economy in the world, I would say. Let me put it that way. So it's got a big gas sector, but domestically it is decarbonizing, though it's still exporting its gas. And even the gas company, Statoil, of course, changed the name to Equinor. But I think more than just change the name, it did change the business model to an important extent, because Equinor realized that the technologies that it has for building offshore rigs also enables it to build offshore wind. And Equinor is now building the offshore wind for the Northeast United States. It's got a big contract for New York State Power, and it's actually spurring a lot of offshore wind industry in my my little neck of the woods. So I think that there's a lot of positive change that's going on. It's not perfect. I was involved in a debate with the Prime Minister Solberg a couple of years ago, where I said that I thought that Norway should stop exploring Arctic gas and oil because we don't need it, and it would be better not to develop it. And she told me, Professor Sachs, you don't understand. So I didn't win that debate, but I don't think that it's a good idea for Norway to go further in Arctic gas development and exploration. But I'm still going to count on my friends in Scandinavia to get it right faster than the rest of us. And we should keep pushing, Joanna, to push them faster. So I think that there is definitely a certain receptivity in the countries to the green agenda, which is rather strong, but maybe not definitive yet. But I think still quite hopeful.
So if I just might add a little bit to that question.
Of course.
That would be, because you mentioned that before, because I asked specifically about how to mobilize the business, really what to do to move them to go in the right direction, not just greenwash in the reports, not just to show off, to gain more money from the markets. And of course, you mentioned the political regulations are probably the most effective. But what else can be done if it's not political power?
Well, look at what Sweden actually did. It put a carbon tax of effectively about $100 per ton of CO2 already back in 1990. So it was an early mover on actually pricing carbon at a very high rate, by the way, early on. And that motivated things. I believe that what is crucial right now, as I explained in the talk, is set a clear goal and timeline, put it into law, get the supporting policies, do the analytics, and then measure, and hold the companies and the governments accountable for the actual performance against the standards that they have adopted. So I want to get into law. What is the timeline? What's the path? And where are the data that are going to measure what's actually happening? That's what I think is the most effective feedback we have. Because in a democratic society with a well-educated population, there is that feedback. And the politics are not perfect, but they're a lot more rational than in my crazy country. I think that making very clear what the timelines and the standards are and what the metrics are, and then having researchers, universities, and so forth, scholars, be the critics and use the data to hold governments accountable for what they promised is not a bad feedback mechanism, actually.
Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you so much for all the time you're giving us, and congratulations on your new president. Let's hope it's going to be.
Yes, we did it. We haven't gotten rid of the old one yet, but he's going.
It's coming.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think it's my turn now. Can you hear me?
I do.
Good evening. Well, I want to thank you again for the very inspiring presentations these 2 days. Well, my question has to do with both the two previous questions, and well, it is. I wonder if, in order to reach the sustainable development scenario that you described yesterday, and for the great transformation that you described today to take place, do you think that the way the economy as a whole and markets work needs to be substantially reformed? So do we need to have, for example, a more present public sector, not just in terms of the classic direct intervention, but of course of regulation, but also of you referred to that before when you talk about JFK, about a mission-oriented role of the state, so that I mean, or is it, or can we accomplish that just by nudging, let's say, today's system, today's economic system?
Yeah, my understanding of this, but I'm not absolutely sure I'm right on this, but my tendency is to say we need a rather large state to be doing a number of things. One, of course, is providing core social services. Second is ensuring the universal access to necessary infrastructure. Three is powerful enough to constrain private behavior, but not so powerful as to become authoritarian as a result. And that's the middle way that I generally label as social democracy. And that social democratic model, to my mind, has been the most successful ideology and form of political economic organization over the last 75 years. And that's, to my mind, why I keep coming back to Northern Europe as being the best balanced societies in the world in terms of a balance of material life, social inclusion, democratic, law-based institutions, domestic peace, environmental sustainability. So I make lots of lists and rankings, including an annual SDG index, an annual happiness index, and so forth. And these countries come out at the top. And they are all characterized by large states. Generally, taxes, as I said, about 50% of GDP, active provision and regulation, but quite rich set of institutions, also a big cooperative movement, of course, a big trade union movement that is still large and that has evolved over time. So complex societies, but very much mixed economies. And in this sense, I think that this is probably, and I interpret the United States as just being, our total tax take or total government revenues as a share of GDP is about 28% right now. And in Sweden, it's about 45%. In Denmark, I think about 50%. So we're taxing in the United States roughly about 16 to 20% of GDP less than in Northern Europe. That's a lot. That's the difference, in my view, of having an underclass, entrenched poverty, high inequality, lousy infrastructure, or lousy infrastructure for poor and working class people, quite good infrastructure for rich people, and so forth, is the fact that we have not socialized the consumption. And indeed, if I say socialized, oh my God, in the United States, political rhetoric for a significant part of the population, that's viewed as being outside of acceptability. So this is my idea. It could be that there are other ways to get to the same endpoint. You could imagine private companies doing the same thing, but under quite strong regulatory impetus rather than direct taxation. It's possible. A regulatory approach rather than a tax and deliver approach might do it. But empirically, if we look around the world and say what's working best, I would say, so that's a fairly risk-averse approach to institutional design, is to try to find the working model rather than just to guess it theoretically. To my mind, it is that kind of large state mixed economy. And I advise governments that are taxing 20% or 30% of GDP to plan to increase their tax collections over time so that they can provide the same level of public services and the same level of redistributive transfers as in the Northern social democracies.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, good evening, Professor. Thanks for the very nice lectures and very stimulating on various points. My question is about global value chains and environmental concerns. I wonder, do we have to scale back this very interconnected, this like explosive interconnectedness that we are witnessing? I mean, also for its environmental risks. I mean, all the transportation costs. If I don't know, I'm thinking about the iPhone global value chain. So you're assembling things in opposite parts of the world. So should we scale back this kind of mechanism? And I mean, could this also imply we have to somehow give away some of the advantages of this kind of economic model? Thanks.
I think there are two different things to think about here. One is the direct costs of trade itself, the shipping costs and all of the pollution and greenhouse gas emissions and so forth related to the shipment of goods by air, by sea, and so on, or long distance freight. And the second is the implications of globalization on the way that economic activity is undertaken, typically in the upstream places in the world where primary commodity production is being undertaken. So what I mean by this is that one could ask, should we have local food because when we ship food long distances, we're creating massive pollution? That's a kind of question. Or should we have local food because when we buy food from abroad, it's produced by bonded labor or child labor or coming from deforestation? So distinguish between the shipment part and the upstream sustainability part. Both pose some problems, but I would say, to my understanding, the effects of shipping, land, sea, and air, are manageable, and we could decarbonize those sectors, though the technologies are probably least advanced for that right now. In other words, we could decarbonize air transport by using synthetic fuels or by electrification of short-haul air travel. We could decarbonize ocean shipping by hydrogen fuel cell power rather than diesel or petrol-based, and so forth. We could decarbonize land transport by electrification. So, and if you look at the share of emissions due to international transport, it's a few percent of total emissions, but it's not dominant. It's not really the main core of the emissions problems. So I've never been persuaded to deglobalize on the basis of shipping, either, the externalities associated with shipping. But the other set of issues is very real, which is that when we buy international products, often we're buying from value chains that are really destructive. We're buying soybeans from farms that are in the Amazon deforested margins, tropical hardwood from Borneo that comes from deforestation to ship beautiful tropical wood to China for construction, or our mobile phones that use cobalt in the batteries coming from slave labor or child labor in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It strikes me that all of those value chains should be brought, or when we buy, our favorite seafood meal coming from illegal fishing of a European fleet in the Indian Ocean waters off of Indonesia. So I would like us to have much more of a documented record, real-time, satellite observed, of these global supply chains, and then require a sustainability certification of these supply chains. And the certification would be regarding environmental management and social management. For example, slave labor or child labor or dangerous work conditions as well. And we're not so far from that. Technically, we can watch the planet every day now from satellite and see where deforestation is taking place real time. And we could combine that with ground truthing and even with the good IT in order to be able to have a complete record of the supply chain so that consumers would know that their coffee or their soybeans or their hardwoods or their cobalt was sustainably produced. And Europe is moving towards a regulatory framework to try to adopt that. I'd say China is probably the end user of the most unsustainable supply chains right now, because China is the biggest buyer of primary commodities, and a huge amount of that is coming from environmentally degraded places. And I think we need to engage China on the sustainability of their supply chains, because that's an externality on all of us, and should be basically blocked. So if we use satellite imagery, blockchain technologies, barcoding of shipments of goods, local ground truthing, we could clean up these supply chains. And I think that this is part of the regulatory environment that we should be enforcing in the next few years. By the way, I would like for DRC to continue to sell cobalt to the world. DRC is impoverished, and I really like smartphones. So I want my smartphone, I want my battery, and I want the Democratic Republic of Congo to develop. And one of the best ways for them to develop is through sustainable mining, not the kind that's done now, but sustainable mining. So it seems to me that there's a big bargain to be designed here, that it would be possible to ensure the sustainability of the lithium-ion battery supply chain to help the countries that are in the extractive sectors, and to monitor these systems and to put them into a global legal framework under WTO. So that's the direction that I would like to see us go. Monitoring, definition of sustainability, enforcement of corporate practices, and knowledge of consumers.
Thank you very much.
Hello, so we are about to close, so I don't know if Jeffrey Sachs wants to reach other questions. I don't think there are. So basically we are in time, but so by the moment I have to thank you again for your insights and availability to share your ideas with our students.
I hope we stay in close touch. As I said, and I'll say it again in closing, you know, Rome is my favorite place on the planet. That's not just saying it it's not just saying it to be nice. And you know, my friends in Rome tell me it's more complicated than you think. But my wife, who's nearby, would verify that when we're in Rome, I'm just in glory of delight. So enjoy your beautiful city, but count on me to show up in person sometime in 2021 when we are traveling again. And I'd love to meet with many of the students in person.
Just keep us informed about your traveling so we can arrange it.
We'll do it.
Also, outside this special occasion of Federico Caffè lecture, because we have other plans. Okay.
Fantastic. Good.
So
thanks to you. Thanks to everybody.
Great. Thanks a lot, and thanks to all the students that shared their ideas with you. Thank you.
And Happy New Year to everybody.
Thank you.